You awaken on a midwinter morning inside your small cottage. The first grey light of dawn barely filters through gaps in the wooden shutters, and your breath hangs as a pale mist in the icy air. Overnight, frost crept in through every draught. A thin crust of ice even rims the water bucket by the door. The thatched roof and clay-plastered walls of your home offer only modest shelter against the chill. The air remains still and frigid until you stir the embers in the central hearth, coaxing a few orange sparks back into flame. Your home is a single-room hut built of timber frame and woven wattle slathered with daubed mud. The floor under your feet is packed earth, strewn with dry straw to absorb dampness. At one end of the room, a cow and a pair of goats shift in the gloom behind a rough wooden partition. In winter, you shelter these animals indoors with the family. Their body heat and breath lend a small but welcome warmth to the living space. The familiar smells of hay, animal musk, and old smoke permeate the air. There is no true chimney in your cottage, only a narrow vent in the roof that lets some smoke escape. When you add a few sticks of kindling to the faint red glow in the hearth, a tendril of smoke curls upward, lingering in the rafters before seeping out. The smoke makes your eyes water slightly, but after years of living in these conditions, you scarcely notice beyond a mild sting. You pull your woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders. Even indoors, you must dress in many layers to keep the cold at bay. You sleep in the same garments you wear during the day, a long-sleeved linen shirt and loose linen braize under a tunic of coarse wool. The linen lies softly against your skin and can be washed when needed, while the thick wool tunic preserves your body heat. Over that, you've added a second woolen overtunic and a hooded shawl. Your legs are covered with woolen hose, and on your feet you wear simple leather shoes, the insides stuffed with bits of wool and dry straw for insulation. Your hands are wrapped in wool mittens. At night, you even wear a knitted wool cap, since so much warmth can be lost from your head as you sleep. This morning, you keep the cap on as you move about, feeling the bite of the cold on any exposed patch of skin. Your first task is to revive the fire to full strength. Firewood is precious in winter. Each piece was hard-earned from the surrounding forest. You burn mostly dry branches and logs gathered back in autumn. Some of the wood came from your allotted rights in the Lord's forest. Fallen limbs and dead timber you are permitted to collect for fuel. Kneeling by the hearth, you arrange a small pile of twigs and dried brush, then blow gently on the remnants of last night's coals. When the embers glow, you feed them the kindling and a few larger sticks until flames crackle and take hold. The orange light slowly pushes back the gloom inside the cottage. You hold your hands out gratefully to the growing fire, feeling the stiffness in your fingers ease as blood returns to them. Behind you, other members of your family begin to stir, emerging from nests of blankets and straw mattresses near the hearth. Everyone prefers to sleep as close to the warmth as possible on these frigid nights. With the fire rekindled, you set a small iron pot over it to prepare a simple morning meal. A bit of yesterday's porridge remains in a clay bowl. A thick, congealed gruel of oats and peas that stiffened in the cold overnight. You scrape it into the pot and add a splash of water from the bucket, stirring to loosen the mass. Food is never plentiful in winter, so every scrap is saved and reused. The porridge begins to warm and bubble, giving off a faint aroma of smoke and boiled grain. It is bland fare, only slightly salted for taste, since salt is expensive and must be conserved. If you are lucky, there might be a crust of bread to eat as well. Bread is the staple of your diet. Dense, dark loaves made from rye or barley flour after the last harvest. By this time of year, the loaves have gone hard as rock, but you soften a piece by dipping it into the warm porridge. Fresh bread will not be baked again until you can spare flour. So the household makes do with what was baked weeks ago. Fresh milk is also scarce now. The family cow gives very little in the depth of winter. What little milk she produces is reserved for the youngest children or churned into a bit of butter on rare occasions. This morning, instead of milk, you wash down your meal with weak ale. In the corner of the cottage sits a wooden cask of ale that you brewed in late autumn. The ale is dark, thick, and only mildly alcoholic, just enough to keep it from spoiling. It is safer and more nourishing than water from the well, which in any case would be icy cold to drink straight. A cup of this ale at room temperature warms your belly as you finish the humble breakfast. After eating, you wrap your threadbare cloak around you and push open the wooden door to step outside. A blast of frigid morning air hits your face, and you inhale sharply at its sting. The world outside is hushed and still under winter's grip. The ground is iron-hard with frost. In shadowed corners, a dusting of old snow lingers, crunching under your footsteps. The sun is only a weak glow behind thick gray clouds, offering no real warmth as it rises. Around you stand a handful of other cottages like your own. Low, thatched roofs, now rimed with white frost. Thin plumes of smoke trailing from their smoke holes. The village paths are nothing more than frozen mud tracks between houses. At this early hour, you can hear very little, the muffled cry of a hungry infant in a nearby home, the distant lowing of cattle from a neighbor's byre. Few people are outdoors. In winter, nobody lingers outside longer than necessary. Your morning tasks in the open are clear and routine. First, you make your way to the village well to fetch water for the day. Grasping a wooden bucket in each hand, you tread carefully along the slippery path. Patches of ice and packed snow make each step treacherous. You know well that a simple fall could mean a broken arm or leg, a grave danger in a world without easy medical help. At the stone-lined well, the rope and bucket mechanism is stiff with cold. A thin skim of ice has formed over the water in the bucket that hangs above the well mouth. You take a wooden pole kept nearby and use it to crack the ice before lowering your own buckets down into the dark, frigid water. The rope bites against your cold, numbed palms as you haul up the buckets, now heavy with water. Some sloshes over the rim and wets your hands. It stings like needles against your skin. You shiver, hefting the full buckets, and walk back to your cottage slowly, focused on not spilling precious water or losing your footing on the slick ground. Back at the cottage, the animals demand your attention. In one corner of the single room, your few chickens are beginning to stir on their perch. You toss a handful of grain, saved from the last harvest, onto the ground along with some table scraps. The hens cluck softly and peck at the floor. With luck, 1 or 2 eggs will be laid today in their straw nest. An egg is a small treasure in winter, providing protein and nourishment that can't be found in dried grains alone. Next, you tend to the cow, confined in the byre area. She lows softly as you approach with a bundle of hay. This fodder was harvested from the meadows in high summer, dried and stored in a loft for winter feeding. You pull down a portion of the dry yellowed hay and place it in the cow's manger. She begins to eat slowly, her movements lethargic in the cold. You check her water trough. Overnight, a film of ice has formed on it, so you break it apart and scoop out the floating shards. The cow's breath issues from her nostrils in white puffs as she chews. Her ears flick, scattering hoarfrost that had settled on her coat. Keeping this cow alive and as healthy as possible is essential. She is one of your family's most valuable possessions, providing milk in the warmer months and potentially a calf that might be sold or raised for draft work. Nearby, the 2 goats you own bleat impatiently for their share of fodder. Goats are hardy creatures, and yours nibble eagerly on the hay you give them. They will yield a bit of milk even in winter if well fed, and one might be butchered in late winter if food for them runs out. Each decision to slaughter an animal is made carefully. An animal means future livelihood, milk, offspring, labor. But if it cannot be sustained through the winter, its meat may save the family from starvation. Stepping outside once more, you turn to the task of fuel. You move to the side of the house where your firewood is stacked under a small overhanging eave. Through the summer and autumn, you gathered as much wood as you could, fallen branches from the forest, logs cut after pruning trees, bundles of twigs, and even dried peat if available. The pile has dwindled significantly by this point in the winter. You select a few of the remaining oak logs and some smaller kindling sticks and carry them inside. The wood is cold and dry to the touch. Oak and other hardwoods burn slowly and provide steady heat. So you ration those logs for the coldest days. Along with wood, you have other fuels. Bundles of dried dung from cattle, saved since summer, sit near the hearth. When the wood supply runs low, those dung cakes will burn with a slow smolder to keep a bit of warmth in the house. Nothing that can burn is wasted. Even the stalks of last season's harvested crops and straw from the bedding can be twisted into tight bundles and used as fuel in a pinch. As you return indoors with your armful of wood, a few stray snowflakes drift in behind you. The sky outside has begun to spit snow, and you hasten to shut the door. Inside, you hang a thick woolen blanket over the door bar to block the persistent draft that creeps through its seams. By now, your family is fully awake, each person busy with some small chore by the meager light that enters through the open door and the cracks in the walls. Daylight is precious and short in these months, so work that requires seeing clearly is done near the doorway or hearth. Your wife sits on a low stool close to the fire, knitting woolen socks to replace a pair that has unraveled. She uses wool yarn that she spun from the fleece of your own sheep last spring. Her fingers are rough and reddened from cold and constant labor, but they move deftly, looping and purling the gray yarn. On the other side of the hearth, your elderly mother crouches to tend the cooking pot. The same pot that warmed your porridge now holds a mixture of water and ingredients for the main meal later in the day. She has added a handful of dried beans from a cloth sack and a few shreds of salted meat, along with an onion and some herbs gathered and dried in summer. This will stew slowly for hours and thicken into a pottage, a nourishing soup stew that is the backbone of your diet. Such a pot is kept going continuously, day after day, with new ingredients tossed in as available and bowls ladled out as needed. It's an efficient way to cook, using minimal fuel and making the most of every edible thing. This stew simmers gently, filling the cottage with the earthy scent of beans and herbs. Today's pottage will be simple but hearty. The dried beans will soften and provide protein. The onion and herbs, maybe thyme and parsley root, will give a little flavor, and the bits of salted pork fat will melt in to enrich the broth. A small measure of barley grains is added as well to make the mixture more filling. You know exactly where that piece of pork came from. It is a fragment from the pig you slaughtered back in late autumn. The pork in your stew and the lard in your pantry are the hard-earned fruits of the annual hog slaughter that took place in November. Before the winter set in fully, when the weather turned cold enough to keep meat from spoiling during processing, you and a neighbor worked together to butcher one of your 2 pigs. That pig had been fattened through the late summer and fall, foraging on acorns and fallen apples in the woods and scraps from your kitchen. On slaughter day, it took strength and resolve. You led the squealing hog into the yard and, with a quick deep cut, ended its life. The blood was carefully collected in a basin as it drained. None of it would go to waste. Your wife later mixed that blood with oats and seasoning to make several lengths of black pudding sausage. The butchering was messy, but between you, the neighbor, and your eldest son, you cleaned and divided the carcass efficiently. Large cuts of meat were packed in coarse salt inside a wooden tub, an age-old method to preserve them. Even now, that tub sits in the coldest corner of your cottage, its precious contents layered in salt. Other portions of meat were cut into strips and hung from the rafters above the hearth, where the constant smoke slowly cures and dries them into smoked bacon and ham. The pig's organs and lesser cuts were eaten immediately or cooked into sausages that could be kept a short while. Thick ropes of sausage, rich with fat and spices like pepper or garlic, if you had any to spare, were smoked alongside the meat. The rendered fat was saved too, creamy white lard now stored in a ceramic jar, used for cooking and greasing pans, and the harder tallow reserved for making candles. Even the hide was cleaned. Perhaps it will be treated and turned into leather or used as a floor mat. That slaughter day was laborious but necessary. It provided your family with meat and fat for the entire winter season. Some of the work was communal. Neighbors often help each other on such days, lending knives or hands, because a single family working alone would struggle to process a whole pig before the meat spoiled. In return for your neighbor's help, you sent him off with a share of fresh pork and a couple of those blood sausages. Such exchanges ensure that most households in the village have at least a little meat to bolster them in the cold months. Outside the cottage, the light that filters through the cracks has changed subtly. It has the flat white quality that comes when the sky is thick with snow. The snowfall that began as flurries now fall steadily, blanketing the village anew in white silence. From your doorway, you watch the scene. Only vague outlines of a few figures are visible moving through the veil of snow, likely neighbors trudging to their barns or carrying bundles of sticks. There will be no work in the fields today. The open fields surrounding the village lie dormant, their furrows hidden under snow and frost. After the autumn harvest, you and the other farmers planted winter crops in some of those fields, mostly winter wheat and rye. Those seeds sprouted before the first freeze, and now the seedlings lie in wait beneath the snow's insulating cover. You occasionally think about those fields with a mixture of hope and concern. If winter is too harsh, the seedlings might die. If it is moderate, they will slumber until spring and then surge up to become the next year's grain crop. But for now, there is nothing to be done for them. The orchards and gardens are likewise bare. The fruit trees stand leafless and still, and the vegetable patch behind your house is a lumpy expanse of frozen mud, dotted with the stalks of last year's cabbage and kale, long since harvested. Aside from feeding a few overwintering cabbages or leeks to your family, those hardy plants sometimes survive in the ground until midwinter. The agricultural labors of tilling, sowing, and reaping are largely halted. Since farm work is at a standstill, winter becomes the season of maintenance and preparation. On days when travel or outdoor labor is limited by weather, you turn to the many tasks that keep the household and tools in good order. Today, for example, you address a nagging issue, a cold draft seeping through a crack in the cottage wall. At the spot where the wattle framework has warped, the dried mud daub has crumbled away, leaving a narrow opening to the outside. Armed with a bucket of clay mud mixed with straw, materials you gathered and kept ready for repairs, you pack the mixture into the gap, spreading and smoothing it with your hands despite the chill. It's messy work, but by the time you finish, the hole is sealed again. At least until the next hard freeze causes the wall to shift. Satisfied, you wipe your muddy hands on a scrap of old cloth. Next, you turn to your tools. Propped against one wall are the implements of your farming life: hoes, rakes, a wooden spade, and the large plowhead stored until spring. You take down a wooden rake whose handle has begun to split and carefully bind it with a strip of leather, reinforcing its weakness. Another tool, a handheld sickle used for harvest, has a loose blade. You set about tightening the rivets and sharpening the edge with a whetstone by the window light. These small repairs are vital. When spring arrives, there will be no time to fix tools. They must be ready to use. In this way, your winter days are filled with a different kind of work, weaving baskets from willow reeds to replace those that wore out, twisting cords and ropes from hemp fibers for use in the fields, carving new wooden spoons and bowls to replace cracked ones, and patching threadbare clothing. The pace is unhurried compared to summer, but neglecting these tasks could mean hardship later. Winter might be a time of relative rest for the land, but not for you. The village community often pulls together during these bleak months, as survival can depend on cooperation. A severe storm or a misfortune can threaten any family, and everyone knows that next time it could be them in need. You remember a heavy snow just a few winters ago that piled so high and so fast that one of the cottages, a frail older structure at the village edge, collapsed under the weight. The family inside managed to crawl out, but they lost their roof, and much of their stored food was buried in snow and debris. In the aftermath, the whole village mobilized. Able-bodied men trudged through waist-deep drifts with shovels and poles to dig out the collapsed home. They rescued what they could: a sack of grain here, some blankets and cooking pots there. Women carried hot broth to the stricken family and took the shivering children into their own homes until the parents could rebuild. Together, over the following days, neighbors provided spare thatching for a makeshift roof and helped repair the walls. By pooling labor and materials, they saved that family from perishing in the cold. This kind of communal response is almost instinctive. No formal authority commands it, but rather an understanding that in the face of nature's fury, human solidarity is one of the few defenses. People share what little they can spare. In the course of winter, it's common for households to trade goods or quietly aid one another. If your firewood pile is running low and your neighbor has plenty, he might leave a bundle of sticks by your door one morning without fanfare. In return, you might later share some of your preserved food or help mend his fence when spring comes. If one family's last hen stops laying eggs and they have none, another family that still has a laying hen might occasionally give them an egg or two. Such generosity is usually modest. Everyone has their own family to feed first, but it can make the difference in preventing outright starvation. There is also informal lending. A family that ran out of grain might borrow a sack of flour or barley from another, with a promise to repay in kind after the next harvest. These arrangements are built on trust and the knowledge that maintaining goodwill is as essential as maintaining one's cottage. Of course, not all villagers are equally prepared or provident. A few may squander their supplies early or suffer losses to vermin, but even they will not be outright abandoned. The local parish church also encourages charity. The priest periodically reminds the well-off farmers, a relative term, as even the wealthiest peasant is poor by any outside measure, to remember their needy neighbors. During winter, he sometimes coordinates discreet help, sending an older boy with a basket of bread to a widow's door or dividing a donated sack of beans among the hungriest families. While resources are limited, The community understands that cooperation and charity improve everyone's odds of surviving until spring. By midday, the stew in the pot has thickened into a proper meal. The aroma has spread, and stomachs have been growling in anticipation. You feed a bit more wood to the fire to brighten it. Then ladle the hot pottage into wooden bowls. You and your family gather around the hearth to eat. The warmth of the fire on your faces and the warm bowl in your hands are comforting in a practical, unspoken way. The stew is hearty if monotonous. Each spoonful offers soft barley grains, creamy beans, and maybe a chunk of carrot or turnip that was added for substance. The root vegetables came from your store gathered in the fall. In a dugout pit behind the house, your simple root cellar, you pack turnips, carrots, parsnips, and beets in layers of straw and dry soil to preserve them from frost. Throughout winter, you retrieve them as needed. They are wizened now and less flavorful than when fresh, but still valuable for nutrition. Today's pottage has a few orange flecks of carrot and white chunks of turnip floating in the broth. There is also the faint saltiness of the pork fat and a hint of herb. On the side, you each have a heel of that hard rye bread to gnaw or dunk. Eating is done quietly and steadily. Everyone is focused on getting enough. Little is wasted. The bowls will be swiped clean with a last piece of bread to sop up every drop. As a small addition, you bring out a clay jar of sauerkraut. Earlier in winter, your family preserved cabbages by slicing them finely, mixing with salt, and packing them tightly into a barrel to ferment. The result is sour cabbage that lasts for months. You spoon out a bit of this fermented cabbage onto a trencher for the family to share. Its sharp, tangy taste brightens the otherwise bland meal, and it provides some nutrients that help ward off sickness. A few bites of sauerkraut and a chunk of smoked cheese from a wheel made last summer when milk was abundant complete the modest midday feast. After eating, you permit yourself a brief rest by the hearth. You lean back against the wattle wall, feeling the gentle heat from the fire ease the stiffness in your limbs. Outside, the snow still falls silently, insulating the world in white. There is nowhere to go and nothing pressing to attend to for the moment. These are the rare moments of winter when you can pause. You close your eyes for a minute, listening to the crackle of logs and the soft sounds of your family shuffling about. An older child is scraping the bowls clean. Another is poking at the fire, adjusting a piece of wood. The respite cannot last too long. Daylight is short and must be used, but it is enough to recharge you a little. Before long, you rise to resume useful work. In the dim afternoon light, you turn to some indoor craft work. From a bundle leaning in the corner, you take several dried willow switches that you cut by the river last autumn. Settling near the door, where the light is best, you begin to weave them into the frame of a new basket. Basket weaving is a skill nearly everyone in the village has to some degree, as baskets are essential for carrying and storing all manner of goods. The work is repetitive but calming in its own way. You bend and twist the flexible rods, forming the base and sides, occasionally trimming an end with your knife. As you work, the children occupy themselves nearby. One child sits with a scrap of cloth and bone needle, practicing stitches to eventually help with mending clothes. Another has found a bit of charcoal and is drawing aimlessly on a flat piece of firewood, leaving sooty patterns. These quiet activities are often all that can be done for amusement when confined indoors. However, if the weather eases for a time, even the young ones crave a burst of play. This afternoon, the snowfall has lightened and the wind is not fierce, so you allow the children to step outside for a short while. They bundle up in their cloaks and whatever mittens and hats their mother has made, and you watch from the doorway as they venture into the yard. With childish glee, even in a harsh era, children find ways to play. They begin to roll a bit of snow into a loose ball and toss it at each other. Soon a small snowball fight is underway, their laughter muffled by the surrounding snow. It is one of the few lively sounds of joy you'll hear during the long winter. And though you do not outwardly smile, you observe them with a faint sense of satisfaction. After a few minutes, you call them back in. Their cheeks are flushed red from the cold, and it would not do to let them get wet or overly chilled. They tumble back inside, stamping snow from their shoes, and settle near the fire to warm up. Playtime is over. A few short moments like that are all winter really allows. Before daylight disappears entirely, you step out to perform the late afternoon round of tasks. The sky is already dimming, a slate grey sheet stretching low over the fields. Dusk comes early in these months. You gauge you have perhaps an hour of usable light left. You start by attending to the livestock again. The cow is given another armful of hay to see her through the night. You rub her flank a few times as she eats, murmuring softly. Keeping an animal calm and cared for can help it endure the stress of winter in close quarters. The goats receive a bit of leafy hay mixed with any vegetable peelings or leaves you've saved from the kitchen. The chickens, which foraged a little outside during midday, are now coaxed back into their coop. You scatter a last handful of grain to lure them in, then shut the wooden door of the coop securely against predators. You've lost chickens in winters past to foxes or stoats that creep in at night. So now you make certain every evening that the latch is firm. Next, you circle the perimeter of your cottage to check its integrity. Recent snow has accumulated on the edges of the thatched roof. Taking a long pole kept for this purpose, you prod the roof gently, knocking off excess snow from the thatch. This prevents too much weight from bearing down on the roof beams overnight and reduces drips when the snow eventually melts. You also look at the walls and eaves for any new holes or places where wind whistles through. Finding none new since your repair earlier, you feel reasonably assured the house will hold through another night. The cold is deepening outside as night approaches. Satisfied that all animals are fed and secure, and that your home is as fortified as it can be, you haul yourself and a final load of firewood back indoors for the evening. Dusk deepens into a winter night. Inside the cottage, the little world of your family gathers around the hearth for light and warmth. The flames dance and cast long shadows across the rough interior. For your supper, there is nothing fancy or new. It is essentially a second serving of the same pottage from midday, thinned with a bit of water to make it stretch. You pass around the pot, and each person ladles some into their bowl. The hunger that gnaws at you is never fully satisfied in winter, but the warm broth quiets it for now. You chew on another piece of hard bread to complete the meal. The fire pops as a log shifts, and you all eat in relative silence, broken only by the crackle and an occasional request for someone to pass a bit of salt or another scoop of stew. When the bowls are empty, your wife carefully scrapes the pot to ensure nothing edible remains, then sets it aside. Perhaps tonight there is a small treat to enjoy. On very good nights, in early winter, there might have been a few dried apples or plums from the autumn drying racks, or a handful of nuts to share. But by this point in midwinter, those have long been consumed. Tonight, the treat is simply a cup of warmer drink. You take some ale and heat it by the fire in a small pot with a poker, optionally adding a hint of spice if available. Long ago, you acquired a pinch of cinnamon and clove, either through barter or as part of the church's alms at Christmas, and kept it wrapped tightly for sparing use. A tiny pinch of these spices in warm ale makes the drink aromatic. You hand the first cup to your mother for her to sip slowly. It might soothe her persistent winter cough. The rest of you also enjoy a swallow or two of the spiced ale. It's only mildly alcoholic, but it sends a brief flush of warmth through your veins. These small comforts are as close to luxury as your household comes during winter. In the darkness of the winter evening, work is minimal, and the family turns to quiet pastimes to occupy the long hours before sleep. With no electric or bright lamps, a concept beyond imagination in your time, your illumination comes only from the fire, and perhaps a single tallow candle or a crude rushlight. A tallow candle, made from the rendered animal fat of your pig, burns with a wavering smoky flame that emits a faint odor of cooked meat. You use it sparingly, maybe placing it on the table when someone needs extra light to tend to a bit of sewing or to find something in the shadows. Often, however, you rely on the firelight alone. Everyone huddles near the hearth, soaking in its heat. This is the time for conversation, if there is energy for it. You and your family speak in low tones about practical matters, the weather, the chores planned for tomorrow, news of any neighbor's troubles or good fortune. Perhaps someone mentions that the miller's wife is expecting a baby soon and worries how she will fare in the cold, or that another neighbor plans to slaughter their last goat next week to share a feast before Lent begins. These bits of village news keep you connected to the world beyond your own walls, even as night and snow isolate each household. Sometimes, to fill the silence, an elder, your mother or an uncle if he's visiting, will recount familiar tales. Storytelling is both entertainment and education here. The stories might be local legends, like the tale of a wolf that threatened the village decades ago until hunters finally speared it. Or they might be moral fables, often with religious overtones. Some are simply recollections of hard winters past. You've heard about the year of the deep snows, when the drifts were taller than a man and people had to tunnel out of their homes. Or the winter when the river froze solid and folks could walk across it. Events from long before your time, these stories are told in a plain, unembellished way, serving to remind everyone that harsh winters are not new, and that others have endured similar trials. The children listen quietly, absorbing the lessons and perhaps finding a measure of reassurance that life continues even after the worst cold. Religion weaves through your daily life and is especially present in winter, providing structure and a sense of meaning to the hardship. Each week is punctuated by Sunday Mass, which you attend without fail unless you are too ill to walk. Even in bitter weather, you and your neighbors make the trek to the small village church. Bundled in all your layers, you trudge through snow or frozen ruts to reach the stone building that stands a little apart from the cluster of houses. The church is modest, a single nave, stone walls, and a wooden shingled roof. But to you, it is a sacred space and one of the few places where the whole community gathers together. Inside, it is often just as cold as outside. Stone holds the chill. You can see your breath in the dim interior as you take your place on a bench. The priest, robed and determined, says Mass with cold, reddened hands but a steady voice. The Latin prayers and chants resonate softly off the walls. Many in the congregation cannot understand all the Latin, but the ritual itself is comforting in its familiarity. During winter sermons, the priest frequently speaks about perseverance and charity. He may remind everyone of the trials of Job or the patience of the saints, drawing parallels to enduring the cold and hunger. He urges those with sufficient food or firewood to aid their neighbors who have less, invoking Christian duty. These sermons reinforce the values that help the village hold together. You listen, not outwardly emotive, but the words reinforce your resolve to get through whatever lies ahead. On holy days and festivals that fall during winter, the church provides occasions for a slight change in routine. The Advent season, the weeks leading up to Christmas, is observed with extra prayers and reflections on humility. Christmas itself is a solemn and hopeful celebration in the midst of the darkest days. On Christmas Eve, many villagers attend a midnight mass, if the priest holds one, or otherwise an early mass on Christmas morning. Despite the cold, people turn out with a quiet eagerness. It is a day of spiritual importance and also a break from the mundane. The church is decorated modestly. Someone cut a few evergreen branches and holly boughs from the forest and placed them around the altar, adding a touch of green life and the faint scent of pine sap to the air. Candles, far more than usual, are lit in honor of the occasion, casting a warm glow and illusion of heat. The service commemorates the birth of Christ, offering a message of light in the darkness that feels very literal to you in winter. Afterward, families return to their homes and, if they can, enjoy a slightly better meal than usual. In your case, your wife saved a small portion of the pig's liver and a few eggs to bake a sort of pie or pudding for Christmas Day. A rich dish by your standards. Some villagers might open a special jar of preserved berries or a container of mead or wine saved for the holiday. These treats are consumed sparingly, with gratitude. Children might receive a token gift, not toys as much as perhaps a small cake or a warm pair of socks knitted in secret. Christmas in your medieval village is not the extravagant affair of later centuries, but it is meaningful. It lifts morale and renews communal bonds. After Christmas, the winter continues, but the days very slowly start to lengthen. In early February, the church observes Candlemas, a day that in folk tradition marks the midpoint of winter. On Candlemas Day, you carry a homemade tallow candle to church, if you can spare one, and have it blessed by the priest along with everyone else's. These candles, once blessed, are kept to be lit during storms or times of sickness as a sign of hope and divine protection. Candlemas also involves the priest leading prayers for a fruitful coming spring. When you leave the church that day, you note that the afternoon sun indeed hangs a bit longer in the sky than it did at Christmas time. It is a subtle encouragement that winter will not last forever. Winter's harshness often reveals itself in illness. In the cramped, smoky quarters of your cottage, sickness can pass quickly from one person to the next. Coughs and colds are common companions in the cold months. Right now, for instance, your mother has been nursing a persistent cough for weeks. Each night, her rough hacking echoes in the dark as she tries to sleep. You do what you can to care for the sick with the limited remedies known to you. Dried herbs collected in summer become medicine in winter. For a cough, you brew a tisane of thyme and honey. If you have honey, if not, a bit of onion syrup or fermented garlic might do. For fever, you might steep willow bark to make a bitter tea that helps ease the heat in the body. If someone's joints ache terribly from the cold and rheumatism, you warm a cloth and press it to their knees, or prepare a poultice of mustard seed to stimulate blood flow. Some knowledge is passed down from elders or the village midwife who doubles as a healer. Still, these treatments can only do so much. If a sickness is serious, an infection in the lungs, what later ages will call pneumonia, or a violent flu, the outcome often rests on the strength of the person and the will of God. As you see it, in the worst cases, despite your best efforts and many prayers, lives are lost. Winter is especially dangerous for infants and the elderly. Many do not survive the season's combination of cold, inadequate nutrition, and disease. Each time someone in your household falls ill with more than a sniffle, a quiet dread settles in your mind. Though outwardly, you remain as calm and practical as possible. You stoke the fire a bit higher at night to keep them warm. Use up some precious herbs to tend to them, and hope. Death in winter is sadly not unusual, and you have witnessed its handling firsthand. When a villager dies in these cold months, the rituals of farewell must proceed under challenging conditions. The ground outside freezes solid, making it an arduous task to dig a grave. Nevertheless, a few strong men will gather with pickaxes and shovels to hack at the iron-hard earth in the churchyard. It can take many hours to carve out a pit of sufficient depth. Meanwhile, the body of the departed is washed, if water can be spared, and slightly warmed, and wrapped in a shroud. In the cold, bodies stiffen quickly, so this must be done promptly. A simple coffin of rough wood, if obtainable, is used. Otherwise, the body is carried on a bier. The funeral is held as soon as possible, often the very next day, to avoid keeping the corpse in the home too long. You and the other villagers attend, braving the weather out of respect and necessity. Standing in the snow around the open grave, you remove your cap and bow your head as the priest intones the Latin requiem. The scene is austere. No flowers bloom, only the wind accompanies the prayers. Mourners pull their cloaks tight and shuffle their feet to keep feeling in their toes as they listen. The sorrow is real, but expressed quietly. Loud lamentation is rare in public, replaced by a kind of stoic resignation. After the body is laid to rest and the cold earth shoveled back over it, people hurry home, more aware than ever of their own fragility. These burials reinforce what you already know deeply. Winter can be a season of death as much as it is a season of hardship, and each family hopes to avoid that fate within their own walls. Beyond illness, the other specter that haunts every winter is hunger. As the weeks drag on, stored supplies inevitably dwindle. By the latter part of winter, say late February, you can clearly see the bottom of grain bins and the back of pantries that were once full. Each household carefully monitors its remaining food. In your cottage, you have a mental tally of everything left: a few sacks of rye and barley flour, perhaps half of what you had right after harvest, a small pile of dried peas and beans tied in cloth bags, a handful of onions and garlic bulbs hanging from the rafters, 2 smoked hams, minus the portions you've gradually shaved off, and maybe a portion of dried fish. Everyone's belt has been tightened by now. Meals that were meager to start with become even more sparse. Where earlier in winter you might have used 2 scoops of flour to thicken a soup, now you use 1, or none at all. You stretch broths with more water. You might boil the same bones repeatedly to draw out every last bit of flavor and nutrition. A common dish in these lean times is a thin gruel. You take a handful of whatever meal or flour you have left and boil it in a large pot of water, perhaps adding a pinch of salt or a scrap of vegetable, creating something warm that tricks the belly into feeling somewhat full. It lacks substance, but it keeps you alive. Wild sources of food at this time of year are few. Hunting for game is not a straightforward option for you. By law, the valuable game animals of the forest, deer, boar, belong to the nobility, and peasants caught poaching can face severe punishment. Moreover, much of the wildlife has migrated or hibernated, and deep snow makes tracking difficult. Still, some discreet foraging occurs. You might check trap lines in the woods, where you set simple snares for rabbits or pheasants. A rabbit caught in winter is a boon, providing fresh meat for a meal or two, and perhaps fur to line a glove. But the woods are often eerily empty and quiet in the depths of winter. Animals are struggling to survive as well. If your village is near a river or lake that isn't entirely frozen, a few men might cut holes in the ice and attempt ice fishing. The catch is unpredictable. perhaps a few small fish, barely enough to add protein to a stew. On milder days, children and women venture out to scour the barren fields and woods for anything remotely edible, the tender buds of certain weeds that might sprout in late winter, leftover nuts under the oak trees. Many will be rotten or taken by animals, but a few acorns or hazelnuts might be found. Acorns, normally bitter and inedible raw, can be processed by soaking and grinding to remove tannins, then mixed with grain flour to eke out bread. This is a desperate measure and results in heavy, dark loaves that are hard on the digestion, but it fills stomachs. You and your neighbors know these tricks and resort to them when necessary. Each discovery, a hidden cache of apples in the root cellar that you'd forgotten, or a pigeon that flew into the barn and can be caught, is a small victory in the fight against hunger. All through this challenging season, the structures of authority in your world continue to influence your life, even if distantly. You live under the domain of a local lord, and while he may not visit the village in winter, his presence is felt in the obligations you carry. After the harvest last year, you paid your rent to the Lord, usually in the form of grain, and possibly some chickens or a portion of your produce. That means you started winter with less than you actually harvested, because a share went to the manor. Similarly, you gave a tithe, typically a tenth, of certain crops or goods, to the church, stored in the tithe barn near the churchyard. These fulfillments of duty are expected, winter or not. In theory, in times of extreme dearth, the Lord might distribute some of his reserve grain back to the peasantry, or the church might open its tithe barn to feed the poor. In practice, such charity is limited and not guaranteed, so you do not rely on it. You have heard of lords who threw open their granaries during famines, and also of lords who continue to demand taxes even when people were starving. You hope, if crisis comes, your own lord will show mercy. Meanwhile, you abide by his rules. One such rule, as mentioned, is the restriction on hunting game in the Lord's forests. Even though the woods teem with deer or wild boar at other times of the year, you refrain from poaching, knowing the penalties: a heavy fine you cannot pay, or worse, physical punishment like mutilation, are too high a risk. The Lord's gamekeepers occasionally patrol even in winter, looking for snares or footprints, though in truth, in very bad weather, they are less active. Instead, you stick to what is allowed, collecting dead wood for fuel, which is explicitly permitted by custom, gathering wild mushrooms or berries when they are in season. These have little importance in winter. And fishing in local streams. Fish are generally not regulated like big game, though certain breeding ponds might belong to the manor. If the Lord's steward or reeve comes through the village in winter, it might be to ensure that no one is misusing the Lord's lands or to deliver announcements. Sometimes, an official will check that the common land, like meadows or fallow fields, is being respected and not encroached upon. They might also organize a team of peasants for a specific winter task, such as repairing the manor's road or cutting timber for the Lord's own fireplaces. Such labor duties, called boon work or corvée, can be demanded even in winter. And if called upon, you and your fellow villagers must bundle up and perform the work despite having your own worries. Fortunately, these impositions are occasional. For the most part, the authorities leave the village to its own devices during the worst weather, intervening only if absolutely necessary. The church authorities are a somewhat more comforting presence. The local priest lives among you and understands the privations you face because he endures them too, albeit with the help of the church's stored tithes. He offers spiritual encouragement and sometimes tangible help. During winter, he will remind everyone about upcoming fasting periods, like the approach of Lent, which usually begins in late winter. Fasting in Lent, and on certain other days like Fridays, means avoiding meat and rich foods. In truth, for peasants in winter, this requires little change since meat is already scarce and diets are plain. Still, he preaches the importance of observing these fasts as a religious duty, even when it overlaps with enforced frugality. The priest also administers the small bits of charity that the parish can provide. He might know exactly which families are on the brink of starving and quietly slip them an extra portion from the tithe stores. Sometimes he coordinates with a nearby monastery. For instance, a monastery in the region might send monks occasionally with a wagon of some supplies as alms, sacks of coarse flour, dried fish, or barrels of salted herring to be distributed to the needy in surrounding villages. On a cold afternoon, you may see such a procession arrive, robed monks, and conversely unloading provisions in front of the church. Villagers gather, heads bowed not only out of respect, but also to hide the mix of hope and embarrassment on their faces. If you are not in dire need, you hang back and let others approach. But if your family were truly starving, you would swallow your pride and accept a dole of food. The church does this both out of genuine charity and understanding that keeping people alive serves the community's and faith's interest. No one wants empty houses and abandoned fields come spring. Thus, through both moral support and occasional physical aid, the church plays a role in helping the community endure. At last, after weeks of relentless cold and toil, signs of change slowly creep into your days. By late winter, as February yields to March, you notice subtle differences. The mornings are still brutally cold, but the sun seems to climb a little higher and shine a little longer when it does appear. On clear days, the snow's surface grows wet by afternoon, forming a thin icy crust by night that crunches underfoot. The icicles on the eaves drip more vigorously under the noonday sun. One day, you hear an unfamiliar sound that you haven't heard in months. The clear trickle of water running in the brook, freed from ice. These small heralds of impending spring lift hearts in the village. Though people remain outwardly reserved, you begin to think more frequently of the tasks ahead. The plowshare that sat idle by the wall is brought out and inspected. You clean off any rust that accumulated and sharpen its iron edge with a file. The wooden yoke and harness for the ox or draft horse is taken down, oiled, and checked for cracks in the leather. If repairs are needed beyond your skill, you plan to ask the village leather worker or blacksmith, perhaps trading some labor or goods for the fix. The seed grain you saved last harvest, carefully stored in a dry sack, safe from rodents, is brought out and examined. You run your hands through the kernels of wheat and rye, relieved that enough remains to sow the fields anew. This is the life-saving reserve. No matter how hungry you were, you dared not eat these seeds over the winter, for they represent next year's bread. In a couple of weeks, if the weather permits, you will scatter them on the fields. Finally, the day comes when the balance shifts unmistakably towards spring. The morning air, while still sharp, carries the scent of damp earth rather than just frozen stillness. Patches of brown ground begin to emerge along the southern sides of buildings where the sun's rays strike longest. The snow recedes slowly, revealing flattened yellow grass below. The village seems to awaken from a long trance. People venture out a bit more, assessing winter's damage. A fence that needs mending, a field gate that has warped. You find yourself outside longer, breathing deeply of the cold, fresh air as you chop some remaining firewood, noticing that your fingers don't ache quite as immediately as before. There is mud now where there was ice, and the mud on your boots is a welcome inconvenience. Birds begin to return. You hear a lark one morning and it stops you in your tracks, for you realize you haven't heard birdsong in many weeks, perhaps one crisp afternoon. You even spy the first new shoots of green, tiny brave blades of grass, or the early buds on a willow twig. These first heralds of spring bring no overt celebration. No one throws a feast simply because winter is ending. But inwardly, you acknowledge a profound fact. You have survived another winter. You and your family have endured the cold, the hunger, and the many challenges that the season imposed. It was not through any dramatic heroics or emotional displays, but through steady work, prudent planning, and mutual support within your community. You maintained the fire, rationed your food, kept your animals alive, and helped your neighbors as they helped you. You followed the rhythms laid down by tradition and necessity, working when you could, resting when forced, observing the holy days, and doing whatever was needed day by day. In this detached, matter-of-fact way, you coped with every hardship the winter presented. Now, as the cycle of seasons turns, you stand ready to begin the toil of spring. The memories of the cold months, the endless nights by the hearth, the taste of salted meat and turnip stew, the sound of the wind battering the walls. These memories do not leave you with bitterness or relief expressed aloud. They simply become part of you, as the winter is part of the natural order of your life. Soon the village fields will be full of people plowing and sowing. The days will lengthen and warmth will return. But you know that when the year's wheel turns again to winter, you will face it once more in the same way. This annual struggle and survival is the shape of your world. Thus, you continue forward, neither celebrating nor complaining, taking the harsh winters of medieval Central Europe as they are, an inescapable reality met with resilience, cooperation, and quiet perseverance.